Contrary to what's often claimed, the American Civil War was not the first time railways were used in warfare. As early as the Mexican War, trains had been employed to transport troops some of the way to the front. Later, in the Crimean War, the British built the first purpose-built military railway between their main supply port of Balaclava and their siege lines at Sevastopol. But the Civil War was the first time that railways would play such a fundamental role in the conflict, with the railways forming the lifeblood of the war machines on both sides, and becoming a focal point of many campaigns. The importance of rail strategy was illustrated early on. In April 1861, President Lincoln called for a 75,000-strong force to defend Washington, which sat just inside Union territory and only 100 miles, 160 kilometers, from the Confederate capital of Richmond. Naturally, this force was transported to Washington by rail. To get there, they had to change trains at Baltimore. But with no direct link between the stations, the troops would have to march across the city. The trouble was, though Maryland had voted against secession, Confederate sentiment was high in Baltimore. The presence of Union troops there started a riot, in which 5 soldiers and 12 civilians were killed. To avoid a repeat of this, Lincoln ordered the military to oversee the construction of a track to bypass Baltimore, allowing supplies and reinforcements to flow more smoothly into Washington. The troops assigned to the construction would become the forerunners to the United States Military Railroad Organization. In July, the main Union force moved south, hoping to knock out the main Confederate army before they could concentrate and seize Richmond early on. But the Confederates were able to rapidly transfer 8,000 troops from the Shenandoah Valley by rail to meet the enemy at Manassas with almost even numbers and drive them back. Both sides now recognised the military potential of railways and rapidly began discussing how best to utilise them. For the North, they could act as avenues of invasion, transporting and resupplying their troops deep into Confederate territory. For the South, they could use their interior lines of communication to shift their limited reinforcements to meet each thrust the Union made. A lot depended on how each side could utilise this potential. In January 1862, Congress passed the Railways and Telegraph Act, granting the President sweeping powers over every railway in the country. In February, the United States Military Railroad Organization was formally created to oversee operations. Military traffic would take precedence over civilian traffic. If companies refused to cooperate, the USMRR's dedicated railroading units could seize the line and run it themselves. By the end of the war, the USMRR operated over 2,000 miles, 3,200 kilometers of track, utilizing 419 locomotives and 6,330 coaches and boxcars. To act as their executive commander in the field, the USMRR appointed Herman Haupt, a former West Point graduate with a strong career in rail engineering, the perfect credentials for the job at hand. Under his guidance, the USMRR would have to create the rules on military railways almost from scratch, and they did an admirable job. Haupt created dedicated engineering teams to facilitate the construction and maintenance of military railways, with repair teams ready to be rapidly deployed to fix damage done by the enemy. They got a chance to prove their worth early on. In May 1862, the Confederates withdrew from Northern Virginia, destroying the 400-foot, 120-metre Potomac Creek Bridge behind them. Haupt personally oversaw the reconstruction of the bridge out of locally sourced timber. Under his supervision, the line was up and running again in just 9 days. An unidentified observer commented that the Yankees could build bridges faster than the rebels could burn them. In time, they created prefabricated bridges, which could be transported by rail in sections and rapidly assembled with simple tools. At the same time, Haupt drew up procedures of how to handle the increased traffic on the network, creating a series of priority tiers. Essential supplies would come first, followed by ammunition, followed by medical equipment, followed by troop transports. Schedules would be organised by rail workers rather than by military people. This prevented self-important commanders prioritising their own units. When the trains reached their destination, instructions were drawn on how to create unloading yards where there were insufficient facilities available, together with the correct procedures for handling the goods. All boxcars were to be unloaded as soon as possible, reloaded as appropriate, and promptly sent back. This ensured a continuous conveyor belt of supply. This blocked a practice of some commanders who had been using boxcars as storehouses or barracks. Some accounts describe an incident where Haupt discovered a general who was using a boxcar as his personal headquarters. Haupt personally seized the man and threw him out on the tracks, tossing his papers out behind him. Under these procedures, Haupt reckoned that a single-track branch line could supply a camp of 200,000 men indefinitely. He got a chance to prove his point in 1863, when Confederate General Robert E. Lee invaded Pennsylvania. The Union armies marched to meet him at a town called Gettysburg. The nearest railhead was at Westminster, which sat at the end of a single-track branch line. Since it would be too hard to manage two-way traffic, Haupt grouped the trains into convoys of 5, which ran continuously back and forth along the line. This kept the army supplied for the 3 days of the battle, while Lee's army was decimated in reckless frontal assaults. The North's unified and carefully coordinated railways were studied across the world as examples of how to handle them in times of war. In contrast, the Confederate response left a lot to be desired. Confederate President Jefferson Davis had spent the pre-war years furiously campaigning against the idea of a central government telling the states what to do, which made things awkward when he was suddenly at the head of such a government. With the state's philosophy aligned against centralization, coordinating a war economy was a very slow and haphazard process. The railways were no exception. Several attempts were made to create a Confederate equivalent of the Railways and Telegraph Act, but it did not pass the Confederate Congress until February 1865, by which time it was far too late to make any difference in the war. For most of the war, the military had to coordinate with each rail company individually, and though the companies publicly supported the Confederate cause, in reality they were much more concerned with their own business needs, and with no dedicated railroading units, the military had little power to force them into line. This caused a lot of issue throughout the war. For instance, in 1862, the Confederate government ordered operators in Georgia to send rolling stock north to aid the evacuation of equipment as their troops retreated from western Tennessee. But this was blocked by the governor of Georgia, who forbade them from straying far beyond the border, fearing that the state would lose valuable rolling stock this way. He went as far as threatening to use Georgia troops to fight any force sent to take the engines. Not wishing to kick off a civil war within a civil war, the government was forced to back down, and a lot of valuable equipment was lost in Tennessee. Even with proper planning, the Confederates would be at a disadvantage. The Confederate states operated barely a third of the nation's track, with very little network and no big trunk routes running east-west. What little network they had was steadily dismantled as the war went on. Worse still, the overwhelming bulk of the nation's industry was in the north. Upon secession, the South was left with few facilities to construct locomotives, rails and wagons. The government didn't help by prioritising factories that produced ordnance. Meanwhile, the spare rails that they had stockpiled were seized by the Confederate Navy, who wished to use the material to build ironclads. With few spare parts available, engines and rolling stock became increasingly worn as the war went on, and any track constructed or replaced required a piece of track to be dismantled elsewhere. A further problem was staff shortages. Before the war, a third of Southern rail workers were from the North, since locals often distrusted this technology. Many of them naturally deserted early on in the war. The Confederate government banned rail workers from enlisting in the army, but they still found themselves badly short of free workers and increasingly reliant on slaves. Naturally, the slaves were disinclined to aid in a war which was being fought against their freedom. Many spent much of the war making as little effort as they could get away with. Drivers could do little to force them due to fears of kicking off a slave revolt. Despite these issues, the Confederates did achieve some successes. New connections were built, bypassing breaks in the line to aid the rapid movement of vital supplies to the main battlefields. They also created repair teams who could patch up track and rolling stock just as well as their northern counterparts, as long as they had the supplies available. They even created their own prefabricated bridges, as there was no shortage of wood in the South. As well as transporting troops and supplies to the front, the railways were all too often employed in carrying the wounded the other way. Over the course of the war, both sides pioneered hospital trains to rapidly move the wounded out of the war zone, as well as providing them treatment on the move. Northern engineers stripped the seats out of carriages, and installed special beds, running on a variety of suspension systems to ensure as smooth a ride as possible. But the rough rails they were running on still left them with a very wonky ride, and many an injured soldier was thrown out of bed. This was one of the main reasons that the most seriously injured soldiers were placed in the bottom bunk so there would be less distance to fall. The resource-strapped Confederates simply had the wounded lie in piles of straw. This meant their trains could carry fewer people at once, but ironically allowed for a smoother ride, since the straw provided natural cushioning with none of the risk of falling out of bed. A less wholesome invention to come out of the war was rail batteries. Both sides built special flatbeds on which heavy guns could be mounted, ready to be rapidly deployed to any battle which was happening sufficiently close to a railway. Lighter armoured blockhouses were attached to many trains, providing some protection from raiders. This protection was a necessary feature. Due to the importance of the railways to the running of the war, both sides regularly raided each other's tracks to disrupt operations. They would burn bridges, boxcars and warehouses, they would deliberately crash locomotives, and they would lift track, build piers out of the sleepers and lay the rails on top, so as the piers burned, the rails would naturally droop. Those with more time could twist them around trees, making them harder to repair. Herman Haupt created a system of pry bars which could twist a rail into a helix, requiring it to be sent to a mill for re-rolling. On many occasions, a well-timed and executed raid was able to completely disrupt an entire campaign. Some of these raids could be quite spectacular. In April 1862, Union spy James Andrews devised a plan to knock out the Western Atlantic Railroad. He smuggled some troops through the lines, and together they stole an engine called the General from near Atlanta, and they raced north, with the intention of burning each bridge they passed over. Unfortunately, they hadn't counted on the tenacity of the General's conductor, William Fuller, who pursued them in a series of vehicles, overcoming every attempt to shake him off. The pursuers were able to stay right on their tail for 100 miles, preventing them from conducting any sabotage. A more successful raid was launched by Confederate General John Morgan in December 1862. With 4,000 cavalry, they attacked a chunk of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, the main artery supplying Union troops in Tennessee. Over the course of a week, they ran riot over the line, using captured telegraph stations to keep track of the enemy. They did so much damage that even Haupt's engineers took 6 months to repair everything. On the Union side, their biggest raiding success came in the spring of 1863, when Colonel Benjamin Grierson led a long sweep through Mississippi, wrecking every rail link along the way, and only losing 12 troops in the process. Not only did this throw the Confederate forces on the Mississippi into disarray, it provided a distraction while General Ulysses S. Grant encircled the key city of Vicksburg. The autumn of 1863 saw the war's biggest troop movements. Following the capture of Chattanooga by Union forces, the Confederates in the area called for reinforcements from the east. 12,000 troops were dispatched from Virginia for this purpose. With Chattanooga having fallen, the most direct route was blocked off. Instead, they were forced to take a winding route along the coast, through the Carolinas and up through Georgia. This journey required 14 transfers and 900 miles, 1,400 kilometers of travel along worn and battered rails. Nonetheless, the Confederates pulled it off. They arrived in time to meet the Union troops at Chickamauga, achieving a rare numerical superiority and winning a surprise victory. The Confederates proceeded to besiege Chattanooga. The Union forces came under the authority of Ulysses S. Grant. Grant reckoned they would need thousands of reinforcements within 15 days to break the siege, and the railway stepped up to the plate. 25,000 troops were transferred from the east, with a journey of 1,200 miles or 3,000 kilometers, requiring 8 transfers. Not only the troops, but all their equipment and supplies, with resupply stations set up every 50 miles, 80 kilometers. They arrived in just 11 days, and rapidly broke the siege. It has been described as the biggest, fastest mass movement of troops before the 20th century. The next year, Union General William T. Sherman pushed south into Georgia with the aim of capturing Atlanta. The Confederates wrecked the rail lines before him, but by now, the repair teams were operating like a well-oiled machine, and stopping to rebuild the tracks barely slowed Sherman down. After capturing Atlanta, Sherman pushed south towards the coast, determining to carve a trail of destruction as he went. Any railway or supply base that was of no use to the Union was razed to the ground. Sleepers, bridges and boxcars were burnt, and engines had holes blasted through their smokestack. It was said that they wrapped a rail around every tree between Atlanta and Savannah, earning the feature the nickname of Sherman's neckties. This destruction served little practical purpose, but it served to demoralise the South, and left their network in utter disarray at the war's close. At the same time, Grant was renewing the drive towards Richmond. Unable to break the Confederate defences, he instead focused his campaign on the rail line supplying the capital. The capture of the South Side Railroad in April 1865 triggered a collapse, and forced Robert E. Lee to flee the city in disarray. A week later, he surrendered at Appomattox, effectively ending the war. It has been argued that without the railways, the war could not have been won. While the North had many advantages in numbers and materials, the South had a key advantage in that they didn't actually have to win the war. They just had to keep fighting long enough to convince the North that the war wasn't worth it. And in any previous conflict, it would have been a logistical nightmare to capture, occupy and pacify an area the size of Western Europe. Had the states seceded just 10 years earlier, it is likely the war would have taken twice as long. But with the railways now covering a much greater area of the country, it greatly sped up the rate at which troops could mobilise, redeploy and resupply. Campaigns which would have taken weeks now took days. This allowed the Union to drive right into the Confederate heartlands. The Confederates too made use of this new technology, but poor decisions and resource starvation prevented them from using it to its fullest extent. Of course, the railways also unleashed a new form of industrialised warfare on a world which had never seen the like. Engagements large enough for historians to dub them battles happened on average every 4 days in the Civil War, compared to every 10 days in the Revolution. Both sides were able to keep feeding troops into the slaughter faster than ever before. It was one of the many factors which contributed to make the American Civil War as bloody as all of America's wars combined. The Southern railways were devastated by the conflict, but the North's saw a great boost. Before the war, trade routes had typically run north-south, in parallel with the main rivers. But with the Confederates initially occupying the lower sections of these rivers, communications shifted to east-west, with the big trunk railways taking on this additional traffic. With the bulk of the fighting happening in the south, they were free to thrive off this new traffic. In the northern states, 600 miles, 960 kilometres of new track were built over the course of the war. But the biggest rail project of all was happening out west. And that is a story for next time. Thank you all for watching. My main sources for this video were Railroad Tactics of the American Civil War by Robert Hodges Jr., The Great Railroad Revolution by Christian Wolmar, The Historical Atlas of North American Railroads by John Westwood and Ian Wood, and The Atlas of the Civil War by James M. McPherson. If you are enjoying this series so far, please leave a comment to let me know, and why not like, share and subscribe to stay updated. I am currently working in the next video in this series, which will cover the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. If you would like to support this channel further, you can leave a donation on my Ko-fi page or here on YouTube. Or for some cool accessories, you can check out my website and my Etsy pages for more of my artwork. There is also my merch shop on fourthwall.com, where a number of the drawings you see on this channel are available in various formats, so do check that out. Links to all this below. I would very much like to be able to do this full time, which would allow me to release much more content to you all, and you can help me get there. Goodbye for now.